The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, religion, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. Joining us on today's program is Reverend William Howard, who's president of the New York Theological Seminary, and we're going to talk about the role of the black church in the lives of African Americans. As you know, that North Star in the black church probably is what kept us alive through all those years of 200 and 300 years of struggle, 200 years, 250 in slavery, and 100 or more in trying to accomplish the rights of full democracy. As a theologian who's looked at and worked with the black church, what do you think has been the pivotal role of the black church in the lives of black Americans?
I think it's been a place where African Americans have assembled wealth. They have gathered to reaffirm their humanity, and they have also found solace in a view of God that accepted implicitly their human status, and they learned there that the lot which they had on earth was not their final state.
That's interesting because segregation and racism and a lot of other things have been clothed in the words of God. Matter of fact, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, invoke God. Now, how does the black church help to rationalize that?
Well, in fact, one of the early ships in the slave trade was called the Good Ship Jesus. But from the beginning, African Americans who were enslaved in this part of the world rejected, in the main, the brand of Christianity, the interpretation of Christianity that was being imposed upon them, and developed a distinctively new understanding of the meaning and application of the Christian faith to their circumstances. And of course, it took quite a long time, up until, say, the 1940s, before African American religious scholars began to codify this. And Benjamin Mays, for example, wrote a book called The Negro's God when he was still at Howard University in the early 40s. And then we have in the mid to late 60s the emergence of a black theology. But that black theology was really a reflection, a scholarly reflection on a concept that began in slavery. So we never accepted the slaveholder's view of Jesus Christ.
To what extent did African religions have some impact on the way in which black Christian theology developed?
Well, a great deal. In fact, the European slaveholder presented Christianity to the African as if the African mind and soul were a blank slate. In fact, there were rich religious understandings, which, by the way, were not called religious understandings. They were simply understandings in African heritage. And that was overlaid with what the African was hearing in the slave quarters about Jesus, and the concept of Jesus not having to play with the hand that he was dealt was a very liberating notion to the African, who after all had no rights, and there was a kind of escape. But it is often mistaken that this was a kind of cheap escape, but it was quite an eschatological escape that sustains African Americans to this day.
It has been suggested in history that the black church, particularly during the days of slavery, grew because that was the one place where the Africans could congregate and communicate among each other. To what extent is that myth, or to what extent does that have some basis in fact?
Well, I think often when we hear about the congregation, especially in this empirical era, we think of structural organizing and politics and plotting. Clearly there was some of that. But it was also a place to be somebody, a place to be where the energy was present to affirm something that was being denied constantly day in and day out, and that is that we were not human beings.
Right.
So the common songs and the remembrances and the embraces and the affirmations preserved our sanity in a fundamental way. And as we see the modern day expressions of racism and economic exploitation and the sort of alienation from the culture and the economy that is going on now, even in our central cities and in rural areas, people still cling to some version of that old-time religion for exactly the same purpose.
See, it's interesting you talk about the dehumanization or the attempt to be-humanize. One of the great strategies of the slaveholders was to dehumanize, to treat, and it's reflected in Dred Scott decision in courts.
Yes,
we are property.
yes.
We're not people.
Yes.
And in a sense, the church helps to make us people. But going further into history, the church also became a political force. Practically all
Yes,
of our
yes,
leaders came
yes.
out of the church in some way.
You know, early on I said, we were talking about the strategizing and the fact that there was a concept of religion, but not religion in Africa. Mm-hmm. That was because politics, economics, culture, health, identity, religion, these things were bound together in African culture. Mm-hmm. So that, you know, in many African languages today, the ancient languages have no word or concept for religion. So indeed, a person's religiosity or spirituality mm-hmm. and their politics and resistance were integrated. Mm-hmm. And that's why we are still catching up in terms of the Greek separation of things. We will now find, for example, some African Americans who have been under the undue influence of European concepts of religion, who will talk about the separation of politics and religion. Mm-hmm. But that is really a foreign notion to the African mind. So when I grew up in southwest Georgia, and an old-time Baptist church, when it was time to mobilize for voting rights or accommodation, access to public accommodation, it was a natural thing, and there was no debate about whether, you know, religion or agitation had a place in the same milieu.
How is it reflected in the different denominations? There are the Baptists and AMEs and several others. How did that come about, and how has it helped the black church or hurt the black church as it's tried to carry out its role of providing succor and progress for the black community?
Well, I think in the early days of the origin of what we know now as black denominations, there was always, you know, all of these movements had some kind of connection to the condition of black people. All of these are in some measure a response to the condition of black people. Maybe not a bold and direct analytical response, but something of a response. For example, the CME Church was originally the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. The African Methodist Episcopal Church began in Philadelphia as a direct result of the refusal of white Christians to allow two black Christians from praying at the altar. The African American Baptist movement, which began, some would argue, in South Carolina, some say in Georgia, some say Virginia. But if you look closely at the origins of these small fellowships, they were both spiritual in their quest, but they also were germinating in relation to the black condition of rebellion, of the affirmation of black humanity, the formation of black family life. Some of those early Christian communions developed around practical things like burial societies. And because of the restrictions on black ownership of property and so on, the church was a place where that could be done collectively.
Now, to what extent did the white denominations, which are sort of mirrors, the Methodists and the Baptists and so on, the Catholics, to what extent did they have a role in causing blacks to develop their own denominations, or was it in response to the fact that they weren't being included, although that's a little inconsistent in that they were recruiting these slaves and newly freed blacks to become Christians. What do they expect? That just as the schools were segregated, the churches would be segregated?
Yes, and of course the ground rules for the participation of African people in those very early days would have features that would not be familiar to us today. But for practically as long as some of these churches have existed, African people have been present in some way. We did a kind of 20-year remembrance of the so-called Black Caucus, the modern Black Caucus in the white denomination, which began in the late 60s. Around 1989, we invited some of the pioneers of that movement to come and reflect before the video camera so we could put this away for the archives. And there was one gentleman there from the Presbyterian Church who took the occasion to talk about the Black Caucus of the Presbyterian Church from the 1840s here in New York. So black people have been a part of these churches, and as you know, virtually all of the major historic American Euro-dominated churches have had splits over the question of slavery. Just a short time ago, for example, the Southern Presbyterian Church and the so-called United Presbyterian Church, another way of saying the Northern Presbyterian Church, they were reunited. They broke up over the question of slavery. The Northern Church always accommodated blacks by some means or under some guise, and I think even though they were present, we don't find that there is a true acceptance across the board of black leadership until the early 1960s. We have, for example, Dr. Edler Hawkins, who pastored for over 30 years in the Bronx, became the first black president of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church only in 1965. But blacks have been there, and they have quite a heritage. As you know, there are many black colleges that have an association in the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church. My own wife's grandfather attended an Episcopal Church college in Lawrenceville, Virginia, which goes way back. So I think there has been this connection. At the same time, African Americans have been forming their own religious fellowships, like the AME Church and so on.
Now, you're the president of New York Theological Seminary, and I know that one of your activities, one of your focuses, is to bring people of various races and backgrounds together so that you can confront some of the modern problems. We've been talking thus far about the struggle against slavery and struggle for civil rights. As we enter the new millennium, there are a lot of things that are wrong with the world, and there are a lot of people who got a lot of problems. At the same time, America is becoming much more ethnically diverse. It was previously ethnically diverse around white Europeans, but by the year 2040, half of this country will be people of color, which means different kinds of religions, etc.
Yes.
So what do you do at your seminary to help prepare leaders to work in this multicultural society?
Yes. Denominations have their purpose, but we are really inching into a post-denominational age. And perhaps the best illustration of this is our context here in New York. New York Seminary has over 40 different denominational traditions among its student body. And we're the only theological seminary in the nation which has the luxury of training a cadre of leaders for a specific geographical location. Every other accredited theological school in the country has its students come from everywhere and upon graduation returning everywhere. Well over 95% of our students are New Yorkers, or they are from the metropolitan area, and they will remain in this area for the rest of their lives. So we have an opportunity to develop a leadership base, graduating about 140 to 150 people each year into this context. And we train them in interaction, culturally, religiously, ethnically, We train them in the different approaches to community organizing. We require this in our curriculum. We have, of course, shared degrees with Fordham School of Social Work, and we've just launched a degree, sort of a dual degree with Queens College in Urban Studies, because we believe that our graduates, if they're going to be involved in community development, if they're going to be involved in transracial and transethnic collaboration for politics, for economic development, and for civil peace, they've got to have the skills to do that with intention.
It's very interesting. You talk about skills and specialization. As we go into the 21st century, we're going clearly into a century of increased specialization with technology and economics and so on. To what extent will some of these people whom you train, I assume they're all clergy people, to what extent will they become some of the political leaders of the future?
Actually, we have in our student body a number of people who are already politically active and in leadership roles in their neighborhoods around the city. And because they are adults when we get them, we have very few students in our school who have come directly from a four-year college experience. We find that they bring enormous relationships, and they are well placed in their communities, and there will be no question that as time goes on, we will find the civic and political leadership emerging even more so from this group. In the 5 years that I've been president, I presided at 5 commencements. I have presented credentials to 789 people. Now, in 10 years, 1,500 people. So I think you can see that New York Seminary is planting a new generation of leaders who will not confine their leadership to the pulpit in a particular worship service.
Now, how much of their activities are actually grassroots community organization, let's say outside the church,
Yes.
and how much of their activities are related to activities in the church itself?
Right. We have what is called a supervised ministry program, which is required of every degree-granting candidate. I would say that by their 3rd year in our school, they are placed in settings where they are supervised. Most of them have an opportunity to work in a community-based organization, sometimes associated with churches. A growing number of them are electing to work in prisons, also in hospitals. A number of our students, whom you would know, I expect, are opting for these kinds of specialized ministries. Remember now, we have the only degree-granting course of a theological school inside a prison. So we're in
Only
Sing Sing.
theological school.
Only theological school in the nation, in a prison. And so we do have that added dimension for students who are not in prison to also serve.
When I was president of Bronx Community College, we had, and the college still has, programs in the prisons. And at any given time, we may have had 300 or 400 students, which
Yes.
raises the question, which troubles me, I think a lot of folks. The projections are that half of the black young men between 16 and 22 will spend some time in contact with the criminal justice system, either in prison or indictment or on probation. I assume the projection is somewhat accurate. The question I'm concerned about, number one, what causes this? And I think we know some of the answers to poverty and so on. But what can you do about it? And particularly organizations like yours, ministries like yours, schools like yours.
It's very telling. We did, through some of the graduates, Eddie Ellis and a few other people who were involved in this research, graduates of our program at Sing Sing, showed that 75 to 80% of the state male population in the state prison system, 75 to 80% come from 7 or 8 neighborhoods in the city of New York. Now, if I tell you that and ask you to name those neighborhoods, chances are you would be correct. what are the things that impact those neighborhoods? Joblessness, a lack of education, and so forth. In the education statistics, you point out that men and women in prison have been able to take advantage of undergraduate study. The recidivism rate of those persons drops down. It's over 50% in the state. It's down around 10% for the college graduate. If they complete our program, it's almost not measurable. It's down around 4%. So it seems that education is a critical question, and as you may know, the undergraduate option has now disappeared.
Because of the budget and
precisely
other considerations, which raises a question about a society that sends two messages. On one hand, we want to have people being punished for their crime, but on the other hand, we want to rehabilitate them.
Yes.
You can't rehabilitate people if you don't provide education and opportunity. And that's an issue that folks like you and myself and organizations like the church need to grab a hold of.
But there's a political constituency for short, and I would add wrong answers. And so people are elected to office by promising the electorate certain get-tough approaches to crime. But what we can tell them is well over 90% of the maximum security prisoners in prison today will walk the streets again. Would you like for them to walk the streets with a degree from Bronx Community College or New York Theological Seminary? Or would you like for them to walk the streets as we find them, often semi-literate, without the GED certificate? Many of these folk who are graduating from college have gotten their high school certificate behind bars. I think there is a real warped perspective about a society that sees this kind of evidence, but yet chooses to take a different route. And of course, one of the things we note is that even the people who are guarding the prisoners are people who often don't have the option of education. There's a tension around that. But if we don't have education as an important part of our so-called rehabilitation program, I hate to think of what we will look forward to.
See, this is clearly a theological issue. A society that prides itself on grace and respect for humanity, etc., to allow something like this to happen, there has to be some distortion there.
Yes.
Agreed, the prisons are a business.
Yes.
And particularly in many states, the prisons are in rural areas where there's no employment. That becomes a choice employment. But a larger society has to understand that. To have somebody who's been in jail for 20 years to come out with the anger and the habits and so on, and not be able to be productive in society, as against spending the money to help them be productive, that's a no-brainer. Why can't we get that across?
Well, I think the religious people, of course there are some who are speaking quite forthrightly on this, but I think there are many other religious people who feel and think this way who have not found their distinct moral and religious voice. I think that they are overwhelmed to some extent by the highly conservative right-wing or reactionary so-called religious voices who have made common cause with those who advocate the simple and unworkable approach. You can find religious voices that are just as in favor of locking them up, throwing away the key, abolishing educational programs, as you will find to the opposite. But I hope and pray that those of us who recognize the point that you're making will find our voice in a way that it would be heard and made more compelling to the broader society so that we can begin to recover. The fact is, as you walk the halls of places like Sing Sing, which I have the occasion to do, you meet young men. I'm speaking about young men. I was at Rikers Island not very long ago, at Singer, at the Women's Building, similar kind of thing. So much of what is ailing this element of the population is lack of opportunity, the lack of community support. As a clergyman, I would say the information we get about being affiliated with a community of worship, never mind the faith, it has enormous benefits. And most of these young people are alienated from these socializing kinds of things. No mentors to speak of.
Speaking of mentors and models, so much of what we learn about each other and about the media, through the media, has to do with extremes.
Yes.
Hate, love, anger, etc. To what extent is this media theology going to tear us apart or help us?
Well, I'm not sure, frankly, because we look to media because as we are becoming more and more isolated from the old social organizations, even the political party has fallen into disarray. The concept of a place where you go and meet the elders who can impart wisdom and guidance, we are now becoming atomized and isolated. So I'm not so sure, given our total dependence on media, that we have a very easy road ahead of us. I think media religion, like media love affairs and media whatever, is becoming an integral part of our madness. I'm a part of a group called Religion in American Life, which has as its principal purpose encouraging people to get out of their place of residence and go to a situation where they sit and mingle with other people. And we do a lot of talking about how one cannot worship watching the television. Worship involves mingling with people, being vulnerable to people, being at the service of people. But it's going to be tough to bring that back, I'm afraid.
Of course, that's one of your roles as president of the New York Theological Seminary, to carry this message. We've been talking with President Reverend William Howard, who's president of the New York Theological Seminary, about the role of the black church in the lives of African Americans and some of the challenges for the 21st century.